The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Chen moved through the corridor of Mercy General's night shift, her movements carrying the kind of precision that came from 20 years of work she could never discuss. The smell of antiseptic mixed with stale coffee hung in the air like a permanent resident of the third floor. Her badge clipped to her scrubs read simply, "Est Chen, RN, nothing more, nothing less," exactly as she preferred. It was 11:19 p.m. on a Tuesday when she arrived, clocking in at the main station where the day shift nurse barely glanced up. Sarah had learned long ago how to be invisible in plain sight. It was a skill she'd perfected in places with names she no longer spoke aloud, in operations that existed only in classified files locked away in Pentagon basements. Now she applied that skill to a hospital ward, moving between patient rooms with the quiet competence of someone who understood that the most dangerous people were often the ones no one noticed. The emergency department was running at 73% capacity, manageable, but the night was young. Sarah began her rounds, checking fall lines, monitoring heart rates on the display monitors, noting vitals with the precision of someone who understood that numbers were the language between life and death. Her scarred hands moved with practiced efficiency, and if anyone had looked closely enough, they might have noticed the small white lines that crisscrossed her knuckles. Shrapnel wounds. Bullet grazes. 1,000 small stories written in scar tissue. But no one looked closely. That was the point. In the patient records room, Sarah sat at a computer terminal and began her real work. The charts told her stories that the official billing codes did not. Patient 40 for 87, admitted with a simple fractured tibia, had been charged $8,400 for orthopedic supplies that cost the hospital $1,200. Patient 5103 had received redundant imaging studies, each one generating $3,600 in billing that duplicated the previous results taken 6 hours earlier. Patient 5247 showed charges for medications never administered, supplies never opened, consultations never rendered. She documented each discrepancy with meticulous care. Column A, patient number. Column B, date of service. Column C, the actual cost to the hospital. Column D, the billed amount. Column E, the markup percentage. The pattern was unmistakable, and it all led back to one vendor, Precision Medical Supply, which had somehow secured exclusive contracts worth $847,000 annually with Mercy General despite offering equipment at 40% above market rates. And those contracts had been authorized by Dr. Marcus Sterling, the hospital's chief of emergency medicine. Sarah knew what she was looking at. Financial fraud. Kickback arrangements. The kind of corruption that operated in plain sight because no one expected a quiet nurse to notice. But she had noticed. She always noticed. It was what Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had been trained to do: observe everything, document everything, trust nothing. 20 years ago, the Navy had taught her to see patterns that others missed, to extract intelligence from noise, to understand that the details no one paid attention to were often the most important details of all. She saved her notes to a secure folder. Not yet. Not until she had enough to matter. Not until she had something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or clerical error. The night deepened. Sarah moved between rooms, checking on a man recovering from a cardiac catheterization in bed 7, adjusting before flow on a patient with sepsis in bed 11, measuring urine output from a 62-year-old with kidney failure in bed 9. The work was familiar, repetitive, meditative. Her hands moved on their own while her mind stayed sharp, scanning for changes, for warning signs, for the small deviations in vital signs that meant something was about to go wrong. She had just finished documenting a 2 a.m. set of vitals when she heard him coming before she saw him. Footsteps. Confident ones. The kind that announced their owner's importance before the person ever entered the room. Dr. Sterling appeared in the main corridor at 2:18 a.m., still wearing his street clothes, still carrying the smell of expensive cologne and the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was heading toward the physician's lounge, where the coffee was fresh and the chairs were ergonomic and the night shift nurses were supposed to remain invisible. Sarah kept her head down, completing her documentation on the computer terminal. She could feel his presence the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, a shift in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the arrival of someone accustomed to taking up space. The next morning at 7:13 a.m., the cafeteria was crowded with day shift staff preparing for rounds. Sarah had just finished her overnight shift and was eating a quick breakfast before heading home: scrambled eggs, toast, black coffee. She sat at a table near the window, away from the main crowd, because she had learned that proximity to colleagues often invited unnecessary conversation. Dr. Sterling was holding court near the coffee station, surrounded by residents and junior attending physicians, the kind of audience that made him louder than usual. His voice carried across the cafeteria in a way that suggested he wanted it to carry. "I'll bet the entire surgical staff," he announced, his tone dripping with the kind of certainty that comes from never losing a bet that mattered, "that the quiet nurse at the window table quits within a week. $10,000 says she can't hack it here." Several people laughed. The residents looked uncomfortable. Someone said, "That's not a fair bet, sir." Dr. Sterling smiled like he'd just won something, and Sarah kept her eyes on her eggs. Then he was walking past her table, and his hand shot out, not an accident, but something deliberate, something timed, and her coffee mug tumbled across the table. Brown liquid spilled across the ceramic plate. Her toast soaked through. Papers scattered onto the floor, including the folder of patient charts she'd been reviewing during her break, documents that had no business being in a cafeteria but had been harmless until now. Her badge clattered against the tile floor. The room went very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from everyone holding their breath at once. Dr. Sterling looked down at the mess, then at Sarah, his expression one of theatrical concern. "Oops. Terribly clumsy of me." He turned to the residents gathered around him. "You know, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly still cafeteria, "people who can't keep up should probably pick that up before someone slips. That's what cleaners are for." The message was clear. "You are beneath notice. You are so unimportant that I can humiliate you in front of 20 witnesses and you will be the one who has to clean up after me." Sarah stood slowly. She took one measured breath, the kind of breath she'd learned to take in places where the wrong exhale could alert an ambush. She picked up her badge from the floor, and a single tear escaped without her permission, rolling down her cheek. But when she looked up at Dr. Sterling, her eyes were clear and steady, and when she spoke, her voice came out like steel wrapped in silk, quiet enough that only those nearest could hear it. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor. Some even survived." The room stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then someone coughed. Someone else dropped a coffee mug, accidentally, this time, and the spell broke. Dr. Sterling's smile faltered for just a moment, something flickering across his face that might have been uncertainty, before he turned away and returned to his audience, talking louder now, talking faster, as if volume could erase what had just happened. Sarah wiped her cheek, said nothing more, and returned to her table. She finished her remaining toast with her eyes on the window, on the parking lot beyond, on the city of Raleigh waking up to another Tuesday. Around her, the cafeteria gradually returned to normal conversation. The incident was already being dismissed, categorized as awkward, filed away in the way people file away uncomfortable moments they don't want to examine. But Sarah's hands had stopped trembling by then, and her jaw had unclenched, and she was already thinking 3 moves ahead because that was what she had been trained to do. Dr. Sterling had just made a mistake. He had just looked her in the eye and declared war, and he had no idea what that meant. The night shift ended at 7:51 a.m. Sarah changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, placing the uniform carefully on the hook where she always did. At the bottom of her locker, beneath extra socks and a spare cardigan, was a pair of worn combat boots. 20-year-old Salomon tactical boots with sand still embedded in the treads from Kandahar, Pakistan, circa 2004. She never wore them. But she never discarded them either. They were the only physical evidence that she was anything other than what her ID badge suggested. She locked her locker and headed out to the parking lot, where her 2009 Honda Civic was waiting in the same space it always occupied. As she drove home through the morning traffic on I-40, she made a mental note to secure her documentation on Mercy General's billing irregularities. Dr. Sterling was the type who believed consequences happened to other people. He was the type who thought his position made him untouchable. He was the type who did not understand that there existed, somewhere in this hospital, a woman who had spent 2 decades becoming very good at removing threats. At 8:46 p.m. that same evening, the emergency department received a call from the paramedics on Route 70 heading toward Mercy General. Incoming trauma. Male patient, approximately 35 years old, multiple gunshot wounds to the thoracic and abdominal cavities. Wounds consistent with combat operations. ETA 8 minutes. Condition critical. The patient was unconscious, losing blood faster than the paramedics could replace it, and the only thing keeping him alive was the EMT applying direct pressure to the exit wound in his left lung while the ambulance screamed through traffic at 87 miles per hour toward the hospital. The trauma alert activated at 8:54 p.m. The trauma team assembled at Bay 3 as the ambulance backed through the automatic doors, paramedics shouting vitals like a chant, blood pressure 72/40, respiratory rate 28, O2 sat holding at 69% on high flow. Sarah moved with the rest of the night shift, 2 nurses, 1 resident, attending standing back with his coffee. The stretcher hit the floor and she saw the face. 20 years older. Scarred now, hardened by war, but unmistakable. The 8-year-old boy's eyes, dark and alert even through the morphine haze. The same eye she'd seen in the dust outside Kandahar when he'd stepped on the pressure plate. The child had been playing near the checkpoint. That's all. Playing. When the IED detonated, the concussion threw her backward into a concrete wall, the air turning to fire. She'd crawled toward him across ground still smoking, her left side screaming, her uniform soaked dark. He was conscious. Crying. Blood from a shrapnel wound in his thigh. She'd torn her own field dressing apart, wrapped it around his leg, lifted him, 78 pounds of terrified human being, and started moving. 12 miles. 12. Her team was supposed to extract behind her, provide overwatch, establish a perimeter. Instead, the radio had gone dead. By the time she made it to the forward operating base at Camp Clark with the boy in her arms, her unit had been officially declared never deployed. The operation didn't exist. The boy didn't exist. She didn't exist. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen was ordered to disappear into a civilian life that would last 20 years. Now he was bleeding out on her stretcher, and she could see him trying to focus through the medication, his eyes searching, and then recognition flickered. A spark. He knew. Not consciously yet, not while drowning in morphine and blood loss, but somewhere in the deep architecture of his nervous system, his body recognized the hands that had saved it. "Let's move," the resident said, beginning to cut away the SEAL's tactical vest. 2 minutes to OR if we can stabilize. Sarah moved into position, reading the monitor, calling out the rhythm, sinus tachycardia, 118, climbing. The wound in his left shoulder was bad. Entry wound the size of a quarter, exit wound the size of $1. Pneumothorax developing, she could hear the diminished breath sounds on the left side, see the subtle shift of the trachea. His lung was collapsing. She reached for the needle decompression kit without waiting for orders, muscle memory moving her hands faster than thought. "We're getting him upstairs," the attending said, voice flat. "He doesn't have upstairs," Sarah said. Quietly. No inflection. Tension pneumothorax. 60 seconds. The attending turned to her, a flash of irritation crossing his face. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway of the bay, watching. He'd come down at the sound of the trauma alert, he always did, always wanting credit for the saves, always positioning himself in photographs. His expression when he saw Sarah was different now. Calculated. His eyes moved from her to the SEAL and back, and she saw the moment he realized what this patient meant. Classified. Military. The kind of case that brought attention. The kind of case that also brought scrutiny. "Get her away from him," Sterling said, not a request. I'm taking this one. He needs a needle, Sarah said. Right now. I heard you the first time. Sterling moved into the bay like a man walking into his own living room. He looked at the resident. Get me a 14 gauge. Sarah's hands were already moving. She'd found the second intercostal space on the SEAL's right side, mid-clavicular line, the exact spot where 20 years of Navy training still lived in her fingers. The needle went in clean. A hiss. The sound of air escaping. 30 seconds later, the oxygen saturation began to climb. 74%. 79. 86. Sinus rhythm, she said, watching the monitor. Sterling's jaw clenched. He'd meant to do it himself, meant to make the save, meant to be the one. Instead, he watched a night shift nurse with 2 decades of unseen experience pull a man back from the edge of death in the space of 30 seconds. The SEAL's eyes were clearer now, the medication wearing thin, and they fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made Sterling's shoulders stiffen. Get the stretcher, Sterling said, his voice sharp as a scalpel. We're moving him to OR now. But he didn't look away from Sarah. And Sarah didn't flinch under that gaze. She'd held worse in her eyes, the certainty of dying, the weight of impossible choices, the knowledge of exactly how long a man could survive without hope. Sterling's anger was just temperature in the air. The SEAL went upstairs. The night shift went quiet. Sarah restocked the supplies, replaced the needle in the decompression kit, washed the blood from her hands under water that never felt quite hot enough. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional bleakness that made the real world seem like a memory. She was still in the supply room when Sterling found her. He didn't knock. His shadow fell across the bins of gauze and tape. You've been here how long? He asked. 2 years? 20 months, Sarah said. Not looking up from the inventory sheet. Temp placement. No benefits. No real credentials, just what the agency sent over. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. You know what I found out? When I called your references, they didn't remember you. Strange, right? Someone with your supposed experience, and nobody remembers her. Sarah's hand stilled. She set down the clipboard. When she turned, Sterling was standing in the doorway, blocking the exit, his expression wearing something that looked almost like satisfaction. They said you were quiet, he continued. Always quiet. Kept to herself. Didn't talk about her background. Funny thing about people like that, they're usually hiding something. And I don't like mysteries in my hospital. I don't like people who don't fit the narrative. I'm good at my job, Sarah said. Her voice was level. The kind of level that comes from holding down something much deeper. You are, Sterling said, and smiled. That's the problem. Good work draws attention. Attention draws questions. And questions have a way of unraveling things. He pulled out his phone, already scrolled to a contact. I've already been in touch with the hospital board. 3 members, actually. And I've had a conversation with your temp agency. They were happy to hear that you don't have the credentials they claim you do. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to resign. Today. Before I file the formal complaints about credential fraud, credential theft, and practicing medicine without appropriate licensure. I'm a nurse, Sarah said. My credentials are limited. Murky. Impossible to verify because you moved here from nowhere and nobody knows anything about where you actually trained. Sterling's voice had dropped to that particular tone he used when he was certain he held all the cards. You have until end of shift to decide. Resign quietly, and nobody has to know about your little irregularities. Fight me, and I make sure you never work in Raleigh again. I make sure every hospital, every clinic, every walk-in center gets a phone call from the chief of emergency medicine at Mercy General saying you're a security risk. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. Oh, and about that patient upstairs? The Navy guy? He's being transferred to Walter Reed in the morning. So whatever fantasy you had about playing hero nurse for some classified military op, that's done. You don't get to be part of his story. You're part of mine. And I'm writing you out. Sarah stood in the supply room with her hands full of medical supplies and the sound of Sterling's footsteps disappearing down the corridor. The light above flickered once, twice, then steadied. She could feel the weight of 20 years pressing down on her shoulders, 20 years of being invisible, being small, being the nurse nobody asked questions about because she was so careful to be unremarkable. She'd made herself into the kind of person you didn't notice. And now, finally, someone was paying attention, and it was destroying everything. She finished restocking in silence. Clocked out. Walked to her car in the parking lot where the North Carolina heat still clung to the asphalt even at midnight. The boots were in her trunk, the worn combat boots from Kandahar, the only physical remnant of her real life. She'd kept them for 20 years because they were proof. Proof that she'd existed. Proof that the mission had happened. Proof that the boy upstairs had been real. Now, sitting in her driver's seat with the radio off and the city quiet around her, she understood what Sterling was doing. This wasn't about credentials. This was about removal. Swift, clean removal that looked legitimate on paper. By the time the military arrived to claim the seal, and they would arrive, they always did, Sarah Chen would be gone from Mercy General. No record of her involvement. No connection. Just another temp nurse who didn't work out. The mission to stay invisible had cost her everything twice, once in Kandahar when they erased her record, and now in Raleigh when she was about to be erased by a man who had no idea what he was erasing. She sat in the dark car and let one measured breath escape, then another. The kind of breathing that had carried her through 20 years of being no one. Above her, somewhere in the hospital, a Navy SEAL was waking up and looking for the face of the woman who'd saved him. And she was about to disappear again. The monitor's rhythm fractured at 0206 hours. One moment the Navy SEAL was breathing. The next moment the room tilted into something else entirely. His oxygen saturation plummeted from 94 to 78. His lung had collapsed. Not gradually. Not with warning. All at once, like someone had punched a hole through his chest wall and let the air escape. Dr. Hayes, the attending physician on call, stood frozen at the foot of the bed. His hands hung at his sides. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The resident glanced at him, waiting for direction, but Hayes was still processing what the monitor was screaming at them. 68 oxygen. Dropping. His eyes kept flicking to the door as if someone smarter might walk through it. The nurses were moving, calling for equipment, running through the motions of protocol, but they were waiting for the doctor to tell them what to do, and the doctor wasn't doing anything. He was watching the numbers fall like a man watching a stock ticker predict his own obsolescence. 64. 60. The SEAL's chest wasn't rising anymore. Just the ventilator pushing air into lungs that weren't expanding. Sarah felt it before she thought it. The tremor that started in her hands wasn't fear. It was muscle memory waking up after 2 decades of forced sleep. 20 years of classified operations that officially never happened. 20 years of keeping her hand steady while others fell apart. Her body recognized this moment the way a gun recognizes a hand that's fired it 1,000 times. She was moving before she made the decision to move. The crash cart was 30 feet away. She would never make it in time. The needle was closer. The 14-gauge angiocath needle in the code box. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Pain was data. Data was survival. Step back, she said. Not a request. Not a suggestion. The tone had shifted. Her voice had dropped an octave, and the room heard it even if they didn't understand it yet. The resident moved without thinking. Pure instinct. Command voice. The kind of authority that doesn't require a title or a uniform. Sarah's hands weren't trembling now. They were steady as a surgical laser. She prepped the skin with one swipe of betadine. The needle went in clean. Right side. 2 ribs up from the 4th intercostal space. The technique was called emergency needle decompression, and she'd done it exactly once before in a field hospital 20 miles south of Kandahar when a 19-year-old Marine had taken shrapnel through his pneumothorax. Same pressure. Same hiss of air escaping. Same knowledge that the next 30 seconds determined whether this man lived or became a body they'd bag after shift change. The hiss came. That distinctive sound of pressurized air escaping through a needle smaller than a ballpoint pen. 52 millimeters of stainless steel. One motion. The air pocket collapsed. The lung re-expanded. O2 sat climbed. 68. 72. 80. The numbers ticked upward like a countdown in reverse. "Get me the 32 French chest tube," she said. "Atrium chest drainage system. Now." Dr. Hayes was still standing at the foot of the bed, watching a nurse, a night shift nurse in scrubs that had cost $63 at Target, perform an intervention that required either a medical degree or muscle memory honed across 17 combat operations in 3 different countries. He couldn't have stopped her if he'd wanted to. The moment had already passed into history. 88. 92. 95. The SEAL's chest rose and fell with the ventilator. The monitor showed a rhythm that wouldn't kill him before sunrise. Sarah's hand stayed steady as she prepared for the chest tube insertion, her fingers moving through the sequence the way a concert pianist's fingers find the keys without thinking. Scalpel. Hemostats. The drainage tube threaded through the 4th intercostal space. The lung stayed expanded. The monitor stayed regular. "Secure the tube," she said. "Pressure dressing. Get him to ICU. He needs a CT to confirm the lung is holding." The resident was staring at her hands. There were scars there. Thin white lines that ran across her knuckles and disappeared under her sleeve. The kind of scars you got from shrapnel or broken glass or shattered windshields. Not the kind of scars a civilian nurse accumulated in Raleigh. Not the kind of scars that matched the muscle memory she'd just demonstrated under 5 minutes of extreme crisis. Hayes had finally found his voice. "Who authorized the decompression?" "No one had to," Sarah said. The patient was dying. She was already moving to clean up, her movements economical, her focus entirely on the SEAL's vitals climbing into the stable range. 98. 100. The color was coming back to his face. Pink instead of the gray-blue of anoxia. His fingers were warm. His pupils were tracking. The machine that kept him alive was doing its job. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Hayes. The worst part was the way Sarah had said no one had to. Like she wasn't asking permission. Like the chain of command was a suggestion that dissolved the moment someone was about to die. Like she operated under a different authority altogether. The way she'd moved through the crisis with the kind of calm that only comes when you've already walked through fire and lived. The resident had already made a note in the chart. SEAL patient, 0206 hours, spontaneous tension pneumothorax. RN Chen performed emergency needle decompression at mid-clavicular line, 2nd intercostal. O2 sat recovery from 68 to 95 in 4 minutes. Procedure performed with clinical precision and appropriate terminology that suggested either advanced trauma training or military field experience. No attending physician direction requested or required. Hayes was still standing at the foot of the bed. His phone was already in his hand. He'd been planning to call her references before shift change. Now he'd have to work faster. A nurse who moved like that. A nurse who knew medical terminology that wasn't in the hospital's training protocols. A nurse who didn't flinch. A nurse whose hands had clearly done this before. That kind of nurse didn't just need to be gone. That kind of nurse needed to disappear completely before she started wondering why the chart numbers for medical supplies never matched the actual inventory, or why certain doctors seemed to have accounts at companies that shouldn't be billing the hospital at all. Sarah was already washing her hands. The water ran clean. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed someone she hadn't seen in 20 years, someone whose eyes held the weight of knowing how to keep people breathing when the system wanted them to stop. She pressed her palm against the cold stainless steel of the sink and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of something that might have been grief, might have been recognition, might have been the realization that the one person in this hospital who'd recognize her face was lying in ICU right now, and in approximately 6 hours, he would wake up. And then he would start asking questions about the woman who'd saved his life twice. The first time had been Kandahar. The second time had just happened at 0206 hours on a Tuesday night in Raleigh, North Carolina, where Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen was supposed to be nobody at all. The monitors sang their steady rhythm as Sarah stepped back from the bed, the SEAL's oxygen saturation climbing, 88, 91, 94. Sinus rhythm on the cardiac monitor. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's mechanical precision. The room held its breath. Then it exhaled. The attending physician looked at her with something between shock and suspicion. The resident's pen hung frozen above his chart. Sarah turned away before anyone could read her face, stripping off her gloves with the deliberate care of someone who understood that every movement now was being watched, analyzed, stored away for later use against her. She didn't know Dr. Sterling was already on his phone in the physician's lounge, 3 doors down. She didn't know he'd spent the preceding hour activating his network like a general calling in artillery strikes. First, board member Richardson at his home in Chapel Hill, a man who'd made $847,000 in referral kickbacks over the last 4 years thanks to Sterling's inflated equipment orders. Then board member Chen, no relation to Sarah, who controlled hospital credentialing and owed Sterling a favor from a blackmail situation involving a malpractice settlement that had been quietly buried. Then a call to Staffing Solutions, the temp agency that had placed Sarah 18 months ago, with allegations of forged credentials and undisclosed disciplinary records. Sterling spoke with the smooth confidence of a man who understood how institutional power moved through phone lines and favors, how one call to the right person could make another person cease to exist on paper. By 0307 hours, the machinery was in motion. By 0615 hours, when the morning shift arrived and found Sarah restocking the supply cart with the same methodical focus she brought to everything, security was waiting in the hallway with a cardboard box already prepared. Not an empty box. An empty box would have been an insult. This one contained the contents of her locker, a photo of her daughter in a plastic frame, 3 sets of compression socks, a tube of lip balm, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a surgical towel, the pair of worn combat boots from Kandahar that she'd kept for 20 years, the leather creased and weathered, the soles worn thin from 12 miles of running through dust and terror with a child's weight in her arms. Dr. Sterling stood beside the security guard, his tailored coat immaculate, his expression arranged into something between satisfaction and rehearsed regret. He held a folder, pristine, official, lethal. "Miss Chen," he said, and the formality of the address was itself a blade. "We have some serious concerns that have come to our attention regarding your credentials and your conduct. Specifically, unauthorized medical procedures performed without physician supervision, falsified certifications, and violations of hospital protocol that we can no longer overlook." Sarah looked at the folder without opening it. She'd known this was coming the moment she'd pushed that needle into the SEAL's chest and felt the air escape like a sigh of relief. She'd known it the moment the monitors began climbing and the attending physician stepped back and the resident's expression shifted from panic to something that looked uncomfortably like awe. She'd known it the moment she'd remembered who she really was, and that person could not exist in a place like this. It wasn't a request. It was a command, Sterling continued, his voice pitched to carry down the hallway, ensuring that the nurses emerging from patient rooms could hear. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Your badge, please." Sarah unpinned her ID from her lanyard without ceremony. The plastic was worn at the edges, the photo faded from 18 months of fluorescent light and hand sanitizer. She placed it in Sterling's waiting palm, and for just an instant, his confidence faltered. He'd expected her to cry. To protest. To crumble into the kind of emotional display that justified his actions. Instead, she turned to the security guard, a man named Marcus who'd always nodded to her in the break room, and accepted the cardboard box with the kind of dignity that made the hallway feel smaller. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said quietly. Not to Sterling. To Marcus. To the nurses now frozen in their tracks, watching a colleague simply vanish. Sterling's voice followed her down the corridor like a curse. "You're done in this town, sweetheart. I've made sure of it." She didn't turn around. The mask held. The composure remained intact. But something deep inside her, something that had been trained to absorb punishment, to compartmentalize trauma, to survive on the assumption that identity was a luxury she could not afford, that something cracked like ice beneath weight. The rain started 3 hours later. Sarah sat at her kitchen table in Raleigh, still wearing her scrubs because she hadn't found the energy to change them. The cardboard box sat beside her, its contents arranged with the kind of precision that came from training, photograph in the center, socks folded twice, lip balm aligned with the corner. And at the end of the line, like a soldier at parade rest, the combat boots from Kandahar. She'd worn them for 12 miles through dust and gunfire and the weight of a child who'd clung to her neck and whispered words in Pashto that she didn't understand but whose meaning was clear: "Don't let me die." She'd kept them in the bottom of her locker for 20 years, wrapped in a surgical towel, a secret that nobody asked about because nobody looked close enough to see the blood still staining the inner lining, or the way the sole was worn through on the left heel where she'd pivoted left during the ambush. The rain hammered the kitchen windows like a verdict. Her daughter Emma found her at 0913 hours, home from school because of an early dismissal day that Sarah had forgotten about entirely. The 9-year-old stood in the doorway for a long moment, backpack still slung across one shoulder, and Sarah watched comprehension settle across her small face the way it always did when a child realized that something fundamental had broken in the adult she trusted. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain, the kind of question that held within it 1,000 fears. Sarah opened her mouth. Closed it. The word she needed didn't exist in any language, not English, not the Pashto she'd learned in Kandahar, not the military terminology that had been the only true language she'd ever spoken fluently. How do you tell your child that you'd spent 20 years hiding because the military had ordered you to disappear? How do you explain that the one time you'd let yourself be who you really were, the moment you'd used the training they'd given you to save a life, the system you'd obeyed had destroyed everything you'd built in the wreckage of your real identity? Emma set her backpack down and crossed to the table, her eyes going to the combat boots with the kind of curiosity that children brought to things they didn't understand but sensed mattered. "Those are old," she said, touching the worn leather with one small finger. "Did they belong to someone you loved?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, burying her face in the child's hair that smelled like chalk and apple juice and the ordinary goodness of a life that had nothing to do with classified operations or bullets or the weight of decisions made in dust and fear. "Yeah," Sarah whispered. "Yeah, they did." The rain continued for hours, drumming against the windows, soaking the streets of Raleigh in that peculiar way of summer storms, sudden, violent, relentless. Sarah moved through the apartment like a ghost, the evening settling around her with all the weight of finality. She'd called 3 hospitals. All had heard the story through channels that worked faster than truth. She'd sent emails to 2 staffing agencies. Rejections came within minutes. By 22:47 hours, she was sitting alone again, the cardboard box on the table before her, the combat boots cradled in her hands. The leather was cold. She'd held these boots thousands of times over the years, sometimes at 0300 hours when the memory of that mission became too loud to ignore, sometimes just before a shift when she needed to remember who she'd once been before choosing to be nobody. The boots had kept her tethered to the truth. They were the evidence that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had existed, that she'd mattered, that the 12 miles and the child and the blood had been real. Everything else, the scrubs, the nursing license, the careful construction of a woman named Sarah who asked no questions and demanded nothing, could be stripped away, burned, buried. But these boots would remain. They were the last proof. She stood, walking to the kitchen window. The rain continued its assault, each drop hitting the glass with microscopic violence. She thought about the dumpster behind the apartment complex, about how easy it would be to throw these away, to choose the life that Raleigh and Dr. Sterling and the hospital had decided for her. To become truly invisible, not just by order but by choice. Her hand moved to the window latch. And then, a sound. Distant at first, so faint that it might have been thunder rolling back through the atmosphere. But Sarah's ears knew the difference. She'd spent 3 years training to distinguish the specific acoustic signature of a UH-60M Black Hawk from a CH-53K King Stallion from a civilian helicopter. She knew rotor blades the way other people knew their own heartbeat. The sound grew louder, closer, moving through the rain with the kind of precision that belonged only to military aviation. Sarah set the boots down on the kitchen table and walked to the window, her hand still on the latch. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see the first lights cutting through the darkness, red and green navigation lights, then the blinding white of landing lights, piercing the storm like a question that demanded an answer. The sound filled the neighborhood now, so loud that the windows rattled in their frames and the cardboard box on her kitchen table shifted an inch to the left. Emma ran down the hallway, frightened. "Mommy, what is that?" But Sarah was already moving toward the living room, toward the window with the better view, toward the sky that was opening up like a door. The sky fractured with the thud of rotor wash. Helicopters descended through the rain like metal gods, their searchlights carving through the darkness above Raleigh. The windows trembled. Emma screamed. Sarah was already moving, already knowing what this meant, already feeling the weight of 20 years collapsing into a single moment. She pulled her daughter close and stood at the living room window, watching the birds land in the hospital parking lot below. Military transport. 160th saw Night Stalkers. She knew the silhouette of a UH-60M Black Hawk the way other people knew their own reflection. The rotors slowed. Boots hit asphalt. Multiple personnel, tactical formation, moving with the fluid precision of operators who had cleared hostile territory for breakfast. They were coming for her. She could feel it the way you feel a bullet before it arrives, the compression in the air, the way gravity shifted. Her phone rang at 3:22 a.m. Unknown number. She answered on the first ring. Senior Chief Chen. "This is Captain James Mitchell, Commanding Officer, Naval Special Warfare Command. I need you to listen very carefully. You have approximately 4 minutes before my team enters Mercy General Hospital. There is a situation developing on the 4th floor that requires your expertise. This is not a request." The line went dead. Emma was crying. Sarah knelt down, hand steady, voice flat. "Mommy has to go back to work, baby. Mrs. Patterson next door will stay with you. It's going to be okay." It was not going to be okay. But the child needed certainty more than truth. Sarah changed into fresh scrubs in 90 seconds. The worn combat boot stayed on the kitchen table, and for the first time in 20 years, she did not hesitate to leave them behind. She was not going back as a nurse. She was not going back as anyone's employee. She was going back as what she had always been. The parking lot was chaos when she arrived, security personnel, federal badges, 3 black Suburbans with their engines running. A young Navy SEAL in dress blue saw her approach and snapped to attention. "Senior Chief. Captain Mitchell is inside. You're cleared all the way up." The hallway on the 4th floor smelled like antiseptic and fear. She moved past clusters of hospital staff who had been herded into side rooms, their faces confused, frightened, silenced. 2 armed federal agents stood at the door to the SEAL's room. They stepped aside without a word. Inside, the scene was controlled chaos. Her patient, the 8-year-old boy she had carried 12 miles through Kandahar dust 20 years ago, now a man with scars mapping his shoulders like roads, was sitting upright in the hospital bed, his eyes wide. Beside him stood a man in a wheelchair, missing his left leg below the knee, Afghan national identity documents visible on the bedside table. A former Taliban commander. An asylum seeker. A ghost. The commander's eyes locked on Sarah and his face went pale. He began speaking in rapid Pashto, pointing, his voice rising to a shout. Then he switched to broken English, his hands shaking. That woman is Ghost. The Night Angel of Kandahar. She pulled me from the rubble when the airstrike came. She held pressure on my wounds for 6 kilometers. She is the one who found the boy. He was pointing at her patient. She is the one who saved him. Everyone said she was myth. Dead in the mountains. But she is here. She is here. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath. Captain Mitchell stepped forward, his uniform heavy with the weight of decisions that had shaped nations. He was 53 years old, with the kind of eyes that had watched too many people die to be surprised by anything anymore. He saluted. Not a casual gesture. A full, formal recognition of rank that made 3 hospital administrators step back. Senior Chief. Welcome back to active duty. The commanding officer's voice carried the authority of men and women who had died under his command. He addressed the hospital board members who had gathered in the room, his words clipped and precise. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen received 2 Navy Crosses. He paused. The silence was absolute. For Purple Hearts. Another pause. The board members exchanged looks of increasing panic. And the Silver Star. He let that weight settle. All for operations that officially never happened. All for a mission that is now declassified as of 1600 hours today. 2 FBI agents in windbreakers stepped forward, their badges catching the fluorescent light. The older one, a woman with grey at her temples and the bearing of someone who had dismantled conspiracies for 22 years, spoke directly to Sarah. Your Kandahar mission was classified top-secret special compartmented information. As of this morning, the Pentagon declassified your service record. We're here regarding war crimes tribunals in The Hague. We need your testimony. You're the only witness who can connect the dots to 12 separate atrocities. She paused. Welcome home, Senior Chief. Sarah did not respond. She was watching Dr. Sterling through the observation window at the far end of the hallway. He was pale, his hands shaking, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. She had seen that expression before, on the faces of men who had just realized their power had evaporated. The security guard who had escorted her out at dawn, who had carried the cardboard box containing her life, appeared at Dr. Sterling's side. He was holding another cardboard box. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something like satisfaction in the set of his jaw. He handed the box to Sterling with both hands, formal as a pallbearer. When he spoke, his voice was loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. I believe you know the way out, sir. Sterling's face went red. Not the measured anger of a man maintaining control. The blind fury of someone watching their entire world collapse. He opened his mouth to speak. Closed it. Opened it again. His voice came out as a shout, raw and desperate. You can't do this to me. I have connections. He was screaming now, unraveling, his professional mask shattering like glass. I have board members on my side. He lunged toward the FBI agents, his fists clenched. 2 orderlies caught him. He thrashed against them, still screaming, his voice cracking. She doesn't belong here. She's a liar. One of the federal agents stepped forward and spoke in a voice that cut through his hysteria like a scalpel. Dr. Marcus Sterling, I'm placing you under arrest for Medicare fraud, kickback schemes totaling $472,000, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Sterling collapsed. Not dramatically. He simply folded inward, the fight draining out of him like blood from a wound. The orderlies guided him toward the hallway, and as they passed the cluster of nurses who had worked under him for 8 years, none of them looked away. Their silence was more damning than any words could be. Sarah stood in the center of the room, in Mercy General, in Raleigh, in the life she had built from ashes, and Captain Mitchell placed a document in her hands. Her service file. 20 years of classified operations. Redacted names. Blacked out locations. Her own biography returned to her like a ghost-given form. The seal in the bed reached for her hand. His fingers were steady, but when he spoke, his voice cracked like a boy's. I remember you. I remember the way you held me. I was so scared, And you were so calm. You told me I would be okay. You kept telling me that. He could not continue. Tears ran down his scarred face. You saved my life twice. Once when I was 8 years old, and yesterday when that man came through the door with a gun and you stepped between us like you were made of steel. I want you to know, he stopped. Breathed. I want you to know I never forgot. Not one moment. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Hart Senate office building wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 20 years. The navy blue jacket carried no medals yet, those would come after the inquiry concluded, but her collar bore the insignia of Senior Chief Petty Officer, and when she raised her right hand to testify about operations in Kandahar that had been buried under 7 layers of classification, her voice was steady as a surgical laser. Dr. Marcus Sterling was gone from Mercy General. He had found work teaching CPR at a strip mall urgent care clinic in Tucson, Arizona, drawing minimum wage, his medical license revoked, his name erased from every credible institution. The name tag on his polo shirt read, Steve. When patients asked if he was a doctor, he flinched and said nothing. Sarah returned to Mercy General, but not as a night shift nurse sleeping through her real life. The hospital board offered her the position of Chief of Emergency Medicine. She declined. Instead, she took the position of Director of Emergency Medicine, wearing scrubs for 12-hour shifts, seeing patients, training residents, her worn Kandahar combat boots displayed in a glass case in her office with a small brass plaque, the cost of coming home. The SEAL visited every Thursday at 1900 hours. He would sit in the staff break room while Sarah finished her shift, and they would talk about everything except the thing that mattered most, the debt that could never be repaid, the life that had been saved and then saved again, the circle that had finally closed. On his last visit before deploying to the Philippines, he stood as she entered, and without speaking, he embraced her. When he pulled back, he was smiling. "Thank you," he said. Just those words. Just that. "You're welcome, SEAL," she replied, and there was something in her voice, not relief, not closure, but the quiet satisfaction of a mission completed. "Come home." After he left, Sarah stood at the window of her office, looking out at the parking lot where the helicopters had descended that night. The rain had stopped. The sky was clear. She ran her fingers along the rough leather of those boots, salt stains from sweat, dust from mountains, the accumulation of miles that had carried her through deserts and darkness and finally, impossibly, home. The trembling was not fear. It was restraint, the restraint of someone who had spent 20 years holding back the truth, who had finally been permitted to set it down and walk forward as herself. Sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. They carry stethoscopes. They wear scrubs. They wait in quiet hospital hallways for the right moment to save a life. And when that moment comes, the world finally sees what was always true. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If Sarah Chen had simply quit that day, if she had let Dr. Sterling's cruelty break her, that 8-year-old boy in Kandahar would have become a man who never knew his savior existed. Would you have walked away? Or would you have stayed, knowing that your presence might be the only thing standing between someone and darkness? Subscribe and leave a comment. Do you believe the quiet ones are the most dangerous?